Hi, I'm Louis, and I am an average guy. In fact, I might be a little bit below average. When I was a teenager, I was on our school cross-country running team, where I always gave an exciting finish at the end of each race, even if it was for last place. Despite my below-average finishes, my coach always supported me, and I swear that has nothing to do with the fact that my coach was also my mom. I was on our high school basketball team, where I was known more for my effort than I was actual skill. I grew up on a small island in Lake Erie, USA. It's a little dot. With a population right around 450 people. There was no tunnel or bridge to the island, so the only way back and forth during the summer was by ferry boat, and in the winter, when the lake froze over, was by small 6-passenger planes. We had no traffic light, we had no shopping mall, there was no bowling alley. To say that it was isolated would be an understatement. In my class, there were 10 students, but at least I finished top 10 in my class. There are so many excuses we can come up with to convince ourselves not to do something new. I'm not athletic enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not talented enough. Why would I leave? I love my hometown. And with all the excuses in the world, it only takes one to convince us not to try something new. We all have our comfort zones, and we all have our insecurities, myself included. My goal today is to hopefully convince you to embrace these boundaries, these personal boundaries, but also ignore them. I want to talk to you about how I got over my personal boundaries so that I could ride my bicycle across the entire United States of America. After my senior year of university, I decided it was time for my first big adventure. And I moved from very small town USA to Salzburg, Austria. Also kind of small. I spent the year working at an international high school, traveling around Europe, meeting new people, experiencing new cultures. And after that year, I've had this weird feeling of guilt almost, that I had seen more of Europe than I had my own homeland. And so that second year, I clearly remember sitting around a table with my new coworkers and expressing that feeling and saying, I think my next trip needs to be across America. I don't know how I'm going to do it yet. I might even just ride my bike across it. And of course, I said this in jest. After all, I had never owned a road bike in my life. I had never biked more than 20 kilometers in a day. Which is why I was caught completely off guard when Jan, the Englishman who I had just met a month before, said, I'd do that with you. I didn't know how to react, so I laughed and I said, let's do it. Now, up until that point, in my life experiences, that's when the conversation would end and we would change the subject. But it didn't. We kept on talking about it. At first, it was just between the two of us. But eventually, we started telling more and more people about our idea. Until eventually, so many people knew about it, we felt like we had to do it. In December, when we decided we would actually move forward with our idea, I realized something that changed my life. And that's the power of saying yes. And that casual dinner conversation in October, when Jan said yes to an idea that I had never taken seriously, he convinced us to do something that would probably change our life forever and would be the coolest thing we would ever do. And so rule number 1 for pushing your personal boundaries is to say yes. In the following months, we began preparing for our trip. We quickly changed our Christmas and birthday wish lists. We no longer needed new clothes or fancy toys, but now we needed skin-tight biking spandex. We needed the world's smallest travel towels, and we needed chafing cream. We naively committed to biking across the country before we had any idea how we would navigate ourselves across. It's easy to build a Google map. Luckily, after a bit of research, we found bike-specific maps that would guide us through the country. But even with these maps, I still had no idea how reasonably far we could bike in a day. Could we do 100 kilometers 6 days a week for 2 months straight? Could we bike 100 kilometers and go over a 2,000-meter mountain in one day? So I did what any good navigator does, and I guessed. By April, Jan had purchased his new bicycle. He was ready to go. I, on the other hand, ordered mine over the phone from the US. I gave them my dimensions and hoped for the best. I traveled back to Ohio then, 2 days before the start of our trip, and picked up my new bicycle. Luckily, it fit like a dream. Jan traveled from Austria, while I, after my pit stop in Ohio, traveled on where we met up in Oregon. After putting my bike together, we began biking through the city of Portland. It seemed appropriate to start in this bike-crazed city, seeing as we were about to endure one of the most bike-crazed things I had ever thought of. And all was good until we started riding. That's my bike. And as we were riding, I hit my first small bump in the road, literally. And the front bag on the front fell right down. And that's the bag I needed to navigate. My map was on top. Oh no. Then, biked a little bit further, I hit another small bump. And boom, my two front bags started to fly everywhere. Oh no. At this point, 3 of my 5 bags were either flopped down so I couldn't use it, or ready to fly off at the hinge. Day -1 was getting off to a booming start. We woke up the next morning, excited for our new adventure. My first goal was to get a picture along the ocean, so that later on in the trip, we could take a similar picture in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, eager and nervous that we would miss the water, we stopped at the first beach. The only problem was, there was a field of huge rocks in between us and the water, the length of a football pitch. So, what did? We went right over those rocks with our 40-kilo bikes to take this picture. It was the worst beach we could have picked. How we didn't break our ankles, I'll never know. I swear, there was a whole football pitch of rocks there. And after that, our first mini-adventure, we then reached our first stoplight. Now, admittedly, Jan and I hadn't really practiced enough on how to clip in on and out of our new bike pedals. And that became comically evident when, at that first stoplight, Jan failed to unclip from his bike and he fell over in what seemed like slow motion. I figured with my bag drama and Jan falling over on day 1, at that point, there was probably about a 20% chance we actually made it to New York City. But we did what we always do. We laughed and we kept on going. Despite our early drama, we quickly fell into a beautifully simplistic daily routine. We'd get up with the sun, we'd bike for about 8 hours. This was stupid, by the way. This was at about 130 kilometers and my legs were shaking, so that was a bad idea. We would then set up our camp and we'd go to bed with the sun. We hadn't really trained for the trip, so I expected the worst. Muscles so sore I wouldn't be able to walk, chafing between my legs so bad it would get infected, and sunburns so extreme that we would be glowing at night. And despite the fact that I thought all of those things were going to happen, I still thought this was a good idea. I tend to plan for the worst and hope for the best. Luckily, hope prevailed. And we never had any serious chafing, we were never very sore. And I only had one bad sunburn, and that's because I forgot the sun would get through the holes in my helmet. Oops. Biking 140 kilometers a day, 6 days a week, for 2.5 months sounds intimidating. By the time we completed our journey, we had biked through 14 states and over 6,000 kilometers. Let me tell you, that is a long time to look at the same backside. In order to pass our time in the saddle, we would come up with different games to play. Our favorite game was called Top 5. Name your top 5 favorite musicians. Name your top 5 favorite athletes. Well, one of the questions we came up with are, what are the top 5 words you would want someone else to use to describe you? It wasn't all fun games for us on the road. Sometimes we got philosophical. Coincidentally, at that time in our ride, I had heard from different family members and friends who had said that our ride had inspired them to be more active, if even just a little bit. And it was at that point that I realized I could inspire people to be more active, to do more, if, again, it was only on a small scale. This moral support reminded me of what became the second rule to breaking personal boundaries, and that is believe in yourself. You can do more than you think you're capable of, and when you think of the 5 words you want someone to use to describe you, I hope that small-scale inspirational is one of them. For the most part, the biking itself wasn't terribly challenging. We biked at a very casual, comfortable pace. But when the weather decided to get involved, things got interesting. I remember taking our last rest break on a hot 140-kilometer day when I asked Jan, I said, "Hey Jan, what's that look like to you?" He said, "I don't know. We don't have tornadoes in England. But that kind of looks like what I've seen in the movies." I said, "Yeah, I kind of thought it looked like a funnel cloud." And right at that moment, a man pulled over in his car and he said, "Hey, there's a tornado. You guys gotta go. Do you want to ride?" Well, we couldn't take a ride in a car. That would be cheating. We had to ride our bikes across America. And it was while biking away from that tornado as fast as we could that I realized we might have lost just a little bit of our sanity in our effort to bike across America. Happy to report we were faster than the tornado. I don't actually know if it ever touched down. Everyone, as far as I know, was okay. While we were biking in Minnesota, we experienced an unbelievably intense heat wave. The temperatures on the road exceeded 48 degrees Celsius. Yeah, hot. And we were still biking 130 kilometers a day. I'll never forget being totally confused by this weird popping sound that was happening. And so finally I realized that was the sound of our bike tires going over the road, which was actually melting beneath us. We survived. While the weather made things interesting, the most dangerous part of our ride was by far the traffic. And I got a quick introduction to that on our 3rd day when we had one of our first big descents. I wasn't quite yet comfortable with my extremely heavy bicycle and maneuvering it when all of a sudden I found myself barreling down a hill at 50 kilometers an hour. Terrifying. And so we realized there was construction and we then had to merge into traffic. And I ended up directly in front of a huge transportation truck. I have never been more aware of my surroundings or my mortality than while 10 meters in front of that truck, I knowing that if I made one false move, I was done. I later found out those are the stories you don't tell your mom. The landscape we crossed was absolutely gorgeous. And while we did have roads that were long, flat, boring, there were some pretty major ascents that we had to bike over. And while I always expected biking over the Rocky Mountains would be challenging, and it was, that wasn't even our most difficult ascent. It was in the middle of the country, Iowa to be specific, where there are no mountains in sight, that we had our most difficult ascent. We were biking along the river when all of a sudden the directions called for a sharp right turn out of the valley. That steep, unbelievably steep, rainy bike up that hill almost killed us. But again, it didn't. Jan is still alive, by the way. He's not here, sorry. Stop saying we almost died and I'm the only one here. He's alive too. He's good. He sends his best. We spent most of our nights in a small 2-man tent, better suited for one adult. We found that in most small towns, we could pretty much set our tent up in any public area as long as we asked the right people, normally the police. And then we could end up next to a playground or a swimming pool. It was gorgeous. We also set up our tent along the Mississippi River, in the middle of random fields, and in people's front yards. With permission, of course. I also managed to get a shower every night except for one, which was really important for me because after sweating and sunscreen and bike dirt, our skin actually turned funny colors because of the dirt. The last thing I wanted to do was climb into a sleeping bag. Overall, our camping experiences were quite positive, but by the time we were finished with our big adventure, I never needed to camp again. Done. We obviously spent most of our time biking, that's what we were doing, but we also found time to experience everything that small-town USA has to offer. We visited the random tourist traps across America that makes it so endearing. The world's largest thermal spa, the geographic center of North America, the world's largest boot. But for me, our most exciting or fun leisure activity was when we decided to go to a baseball game in Great Falls, Montana. Now, experiencing a baseball game with an Englishman was interesting in itself, but it was an extra bonus when we showed up and realized they were giving away free boxes of cereal to the first 500 people. Now, we didn't have room for a box of cereal on our bikes, and we were always hungry, so we shamelessly ate those boxes of cereals throughout the game, which surprisingly no one else did. They were pretty dry. In the end, the hardest part of biking across America was having it come to a close. We had spent over 6 months planning for it, and over 2 months actually doing it. And as we biked into New York City, Manhattan Bridge, as we biked into New York City, I was not only overwhelmed by all of the cars, but also this mix of feelings that I didn't expect. This only intensified as we stood at the Atlantic Ocean, realizing we had made it. And when I thought back to those first days, and all of the adventures in between, I couldn't believe we were actually there. And then, with the excitement of 2 small children, we plunged right in. That salt water has never tasted so sweet before. I was overwhelmed with pride, but also sadness that it was over. One thing was for sure, though, that we had accomplished one of the most special things we ever would, while also not just inspiring ourselves, but also inspiring others. When we completed the ride, I figured this would be the pinnacle. Sure, I'd have hopefully, have other lifetime milestones like getting married and having kids, but would I ever experience an adventure quite like this? Probably not. But I promised myself I would be open to new ideas. And that leads me to the third and final rule for breaking personal boundaries. And that's to allow yourself to be inspired by others, especially average people. Don't just hear people when they speak, but listen. Allow yourself to be moved and, as I mentioned earlier, small-scale inspired. And with that, I found myself back in Salzburg, back in the cafeteria, when another new staff member said, "It was a year ago today that my brother was on top Kilimanjaro." Jan and I looked at each other without saying anything, and we were thinking, normal people climb Kilimanjaro? But that is for another talk.